Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Welcome back to another episode of Resuming Debate. I'm your host, MP Garnett Genuis. There are a number of bills before Parliament right now that deal with the issue of pornography, in particular seeking to respond to concerns around issues involving children and pornography, either children being depicted or filmed or children viewing pornography. Those bills are Bill S-210, a Senate bill that introduces a requirement for meaningful age verification to try to prevent children from accessing pornography online. There's also Bill C-270 from my colleague and previous podcast guest Arnold Viersen that deals with the pornography with children in it or non-consenting persons, requiring that platforms maintain proof of consent for anything on their platform. There's also a government bill, Bill C-63, that is kind of an omnibus bill dealing with different kinds of online harms, although Bill C-63 also deals with speech and censorship and some concerns around that. I would argue that some of its provisions even on these kinds of online harms issues are much less effective than the others. But nonetheless, I thought rather than having another politician on, we would talk to someone with significant clinical, scientific expertise around the issue of pornography and its impacts. So I am very pleased to be joined by a real expert on this, Dr. Jocelyn Monsma Selby. I won't read her whole bio, but she's a mental health professional with 43 years of clinical practice experience. She has a PhD in clinical sexuality. She's also the chair of something called Connecting to Protect, which we will talk about in more detail. So, Dr. Monsma Selby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Garnett. I'm pleased to be here and to talk about this topic. And I got into this space in 2017 and was invited to the London School of Economics, where we developed what we call, as a result of that seminar that was going on in London, we decided that we needed to address the harms of children accessing pornography online. And the best way to do that was to form a global working group. So we gathered the experts that we knew were in this space, and we came together and we planned a global summit. My co-chair of that was from Australia, and they were really moving ahead in Australia to develop legislation to educate the public in this space. And so it was a very good partnership. And what we ended up doing is, due to COVID, things got postponed. We were hoping to do it in person, but we ended up doing it virtually in 2022, in February of 2022. And what ended up happening is we had a funder donate funds so that we could publish a paper as a result of the findings from that summit. So the summit was a public health approach that involves several tiers. And a public health approach is always engaged in when it's beyond an individual's capacity to correct something themselves. And so we realized that this was a multi-dimensional problem, and that it not only involved the harms from children accessing pornography online, but it also involved the public health system, in that we needed educators to have tools to become aware of how to deal with this. We needed therapists to be able to understand what the dynamics of the problem were and how to treat it. And we needed regulators, and we needed government officials involved, and we needed neuroscientists and other medical professionals that worked in this space to be a part of this and collate all of that information. And so as a result of that, a few of us kind of realized that we need to do more and we need to do something different. So I then partnered with an individual from the UK who had expertise in regulation and was going to implement age verification in the UK, and it was all passed through the government. Then there was a government change, an election with Boris Johnson, and it was quashed, and nobody completely knew why. The legislation had just been stopped. So nothing happened. And now, of course, you might be aware that Britain does have legislation in place this past year that just was passed through Parliament, and now they have a designated regulator that will be implementing age verification in the UK to protect children from the harms of accessing pornography. So that's kind of how we got here. My partner and I in the UK have been meeting with adult industry leaders to discuss the importance of all of us working together. And this is an interesting topic because I think it's been very challenging to coordinate the different factions because we always have the people that want to shut down the porn industry. We have the free speech people that say, you know, if you have age verification, you're going against free speech, and children have a right to this information. And yet we have hundreds of studies now that show the harms from children accessing pornography online. So my partner and I started meeting with the largest porn sites in the world to see if we could come up with a coordinated effort on this approach in between regulation, child protection, and the industry.
So just taking a step back from some of that, I want to zero in on something you said. You mentioned taking a public health approach to this issue. I think a lot of people's familiarity with discussions around pornography would be kind of in the domain of you know, personal preference or morality, depending on kind of what side you're coming from. What does it mean to say, you know, we're not talking about this in the context of those kinds of domains, but we're talking about it in terms of public health? And why is a public health lens important? What does pornography have to do with public health?
So I think we have to look at the problems. And we know that 1 in 3 children in the world have access to a digital device. Most children have access to phones. And we know that in so many places around the world, including Canada, there are no restrictions on what you can access on your phone. So an innocent child can type in SE and they are going to get a plethora of pornographic sites that are going to pop up. And so we needed to look at, okay, how does that happen? Well, that's where we need regulation, and governments, as you know, are responsible for implementing regulation. And so we need regulation that is fit for purpose, regulation that will protect all children. And so this is where we have an umbrella term called age assurance. And under the age assurance umbrella falls age verification technologies. Now, how age assurance gets activated is another discussion, and maybe it'll be a part of our discussion today. And I'm happy to talk about that. But I think you really want to hear about the harms to children first and why the public health approach, right?
Yeah, exactly. So why is this a public health issue as opposed to a kind of a values or preferences question?
Right. So we have over 6 million children in Canada right now that are probably under the age of 18. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's significant. Those children can access visual materials containing explicit displays of sexual organs and or sexual activities, whether real or simulated, that cause an erotic response and sensations, or what we call sexual arousal. And it impacts children in many, many different ways. And because it is so accessible through digital devices, we need to look at this from a public health lens. And because the harms are so significant, and I can read you some stats that you might find staggering, but I'll tell you about the harms first.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the first harms is childhood trauma and developmental issues. So, depending on how pornography plays out, and how a child accesses it. So if a child is exposed to it via another child, which sometimes and a lot of the time happens because kids have phones and they show each other what they've seen, and then they are curious. So then they start to look for more. You can end up with what we call child on child sexual abuse, right? You can end up with self-exploitation and sexting and self-created videos, and those kinds of things can happen. You can also have what we call the normalization of what children are exposed to in these pornographic sites that they access, whatever they happen to stumble on, where they are now normalizing the types of behaviors that they're seeing. And they're also might be thinking that they need to do those types of behaviors. And so that becomes a problem. So they might end up in risky or inappropriate sexual activities as someone who's even consenting with another teenager that could be harmful to them. So then you've got the whole issue of child sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, which I know Arnold has really made a mission to discuss as well. Well, pornography, there's an intersection with pornography and child sex trafficking because a lot of children that are trafficked are used for child pornography. And there is a whole dark web situation where adults who sometimes, and this I've seen this in clinical practice, will be accessing regular pornography online. And because pornography is always about new and different, whereas if you have a substance use issue, it's about more of the substance, but with pornography, it's new and different. So they're clicking and clicking for many years, usually. So let's say the average age of exposure in the research is about 11 to 12 years old.
Wow.
But we also have anecdotal research to show kids as young as 4 years old are stumbling on pornography, right? So how do they make sense of that in their young minds about what this is? So we often know that a lot of children, that 27% of children by age 11 have stumbled on pornographic content, 10% by age 9, right? So it's getting younger and younger. So 20, if you've got 27% by age 11 and 10% by age 9, and now we have all this anecdotal research to show that it happens to children much younger, we have an issue. Now, when children who speak about their interaction or their stumbling on pornography, they will often talk about how they felt unbearable pressure to view hardcore pornography, even if they don't want to. And much of the hardcore pornography that children view depicts degrading acts of violence against minorities and against women. There are often very graphic scenes that I won't describe in your podcast because it might become very distressing for the audience to hear it, but that is often what is in mainstream pornography, right? This is not the benign sort of images of Playboy and then Penthouse and Hustler. That is all considered very minor now when you look at what is available in online porn, which most people don't dissect it to this level, right? Mm-hmm. So when you look at, Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler, Hustler was way more graphic than Penthouse, and Playboy was like what we would just see as nude photos now. And people would purchase it for the articles because Hefner, had a brilliant business model. He wanted people to buy his magazine because it was a lifestyle magazine. I don't know if you knew that, if you ever heard that, but that, it was really his motivation, and he had fabulous articles. So an individual who purchased it, their excuse would always be, oh, that was because there's great articles in there, not because they wanted to see, a photo of their favorite person nude, right? But that is nothing compared to what online pornography is now, that children are exposed to. So if they're exposed to this aggressive behavior going on against minorities and against women in particular, then they are likely to sometimes mimic that and think that that's okay.
Can I throw in on one piece that you said? This
Sure.
is very, very interesting and troubling. You talked about kids reporting that they felt pressure to keep watching it even if they didn't want to. But I suppose you're talking about a situation in which they're stumbling on this material alone. So what's the context of that pressure?
Well, it could be like we often hear from teenagers, and there's research that where they've interviewed a variety of teens and asked them about this experience. But we often find that teenagers then feel that when they are with another teen, that they need to enact what they saw on pornography, or one of the other parties will say, I want you to do this to me, like you saw on that video. I want you to do this with me. Let's watch it. And then I want you to do it. Or I want to do it to you. Right. So it's a whole different level of sexual exposure and the type of sexual education that might not be healthy for the long term if it's aggressive and violent.
So do you have statistics on just the prevalence of this kind of violence or kind of the acting out of these kinds of scenes?
Okay, so 41% of kids reported seeing online porn during the school day. How does that happen?
During the school day.
Yes. And that's from the Ballard Brief. 3/4 of teenagers admitted to viewing pornography by the age of 17. Nearly 60% of all kids surveyed say they stumbled on it by accident. Now, this is really shocking stuff coming up next. It's sort of the impacts of COVID-19 and the relationship to pornography. So in December of 2022, the FBI issued a public safety alert about an explosion of financial and sexual extortion schemes targeting children and teens. That's pretty disturbing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The number of reports the U.S. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, its acronym is like NCMEC, received on this same issue of sexual exploitation in children increased by 7,200% between 2021 and 2022, which is quite an astronomical situation. Why a public health approach? Now, the next stat to me is the most shocking and the most disturbing. That there has been a 360% increase in self-generated images. Are you ready for this? Of 7 to 10-year-olds from 2020 to 2022. Self-generated sexual images of 7 to 10-year-olds. A 360% increase. That is from an exceptionally reliable organization called the Internet Watch Foundation. So
these are kids that are seeing things,
yes,
imitating them.
yes,
Okay.
and then putting it online. That isn't children that are necessarily being coerced by an adult. This is just self-generated sexual imagery.
Hmm.
Yeah. Now, I've got some other stuff here that'll be
Yeah.
interesting. The volume of child sexual exploitation material. So this is the type of material that um, adults morph into because they are not finding enough new and different on your regular porn sites, which is, I know it seems, I don't know if you've ever been on a porn site, but they have hundreds of menu items. And so what happens is new and different clicking, clicking, clicking. And for whatever reasons, usually it's a rupture in their own personal development at a much younger age. They are vulnerable to wanting child sexual exploitation material, which is child pornography. Okay. Reports of that has increased by 87% since 2019. That's significant. In young adults of 18 to 19-year-olds, 80% saw porn and only 26% said they saw it on purpose. So that's a bit of a concern, right? It's all accidentally stumbling on this stuff, which means why we need regulation, why we need child protection. The other thing that I find interesting is as Canadians, we have turned the S210 debate into a partisan debate. It should be a nonpartisan issue to protect children from the harms of accessing this. And the other thing that I find concerning is that not only have we turned it into a partisan debate, but we also are like some of the last countries at the table to do anything about it, right? Right now in the US, by July, there will be 17 states that will be implementing, and that's as of today, that will be implementing regulation that will come into effect. Right now, there's currently 8 states in the US that have legislation enforced and 9 states in the US that have enacted it that will come into force in July. There's another 35 other bills in progress in the US, and we can't get our government to agree on S210 to protect children.
Yeah.
And yet the evidence of the harms is astronomical, and why we need the public health approach.
Yeah.
And
Would you?
Arnold started this way back in 2016
Mhm.
with the first bill that went forward.
Yeah.
And then there was an investigation done, and nothing happened. Nothing happened.
Yeah.
Then it was brought forward again as a bill to the Senate. I think it was 2020. I know because I attended as an expert witness for that.
Hmm.
And again, a government change and everything got stopped and all started again since the past election to S210. And now it's become a partisan issue, which is very, very disappointing because I don't think there's a child protection expert on the planet that would allow a parent to watch pornography in front of a child or to turn it on for a child for any purposes without claiming child sexual abuse, but yet we're allowing this to go on 24/7 and we're not protecting anyone.
Yeah. The description of the harms is quite troubling and quite jarring, um, and I think it's a really important information for people because, of course, these are issues being discussed, debated, considered by everyone's democratic representatives. So if this information is as jarring for you, the listener, as it is for me, um, then you need to be communicating with your representatives about the need for action around it. Um, you mentioned Bill S210 requiring meaningful age verification, and I want to come back to some of the kind of the evidence you talked about, dig more into that, but um, it hasn't been that partisan for a while, but it's become a little more partisan now because the bill was unanimously supported in the Senate. Every single senator supported it. Now, at second reading vote in the House, you had every Conservative, every NDP, every Bloc member, not a natural collection of people to be working together, and over a dozen Liberal MPs. But it was the Liberal cabinet and the majority of the Liberal caucus who voted against the bill. And I don't think we've ever gotten a really good explanation for it. I think one of the issues may be lobbying and misinformation from the pornography industry. You mentioned earlier about trying to engage the pornography industry in dialogue. That surprised me a little bit because, I mean, obviously they would have a profound financial incentive in avoiding the discussion of this as a public health issue. So what has been the nature of those conversations, and am I wrong in assuming that they would have no interest in acknowledging potential harms?
It's not what you think.
Okay.
So this has been fascinating for us. So when I met with, the person who runs ALO, so you're probably aware of this, but most of our listeners aren't. The pornography industry globally is run by Canadians. And that doesn't just mean ALO, who owns Pornhub, that many of you are aware of. There's also other sites that are run by Canadians that don't even run out of Canada. That get 240 million unique hits a day. Pornhub only gets 140 million-ish unique hits a day, which is disturbing in itself, right? Mm-hmm. If you're concerned about who's viewing what. So if you go to a website that shows you who gets the largest hits out of all of the sites, so you're looking at Amazon, you're looking at Google. Google's probably number 1 in the world, but I can tell you the porn sites start at number 11. They're ahead of TikTok. They're ahead of, I think they might even be ahead of Amazon, to be quite honest. You'd have to Google it. I haven't Googled it lately. But when we met with the porn companies, they are not against. They don't want children on their sites. At least that's what they
say.
That's what they say to us. And so I actually have a tendency to believe some of that. Actually, I do believe that they don't want children on their sites because children can't be verified to go to the higher level of pay. And so we have the thing with pornography is that it's accessible and it's affordable because most of it's free, but they only make their money from the pay sites, right? So they would prefer to be able to have an adult move to a pay site. How do you think OnlyFans has gone from starting in 2016 to being a $2 billion industry in 2023 or 2022, right? It's pornography and it's pay. They have subscriptions to their creators, right? Mm-hmm. So they verify, and we've met with them as well, they verify several different ways that their creator is of age. But how are they verifying that the purchaser is of age, right?
And they're not, or?
Well, I don't know 100% around that. I think the issue is they do have very good protocols in place as far as companies go. Mm-hmm. I know that the largest porn sites like ALO, they've worked very closely with organizations to identify child sexual exploitation, in particular since they were exposed way back with Nicholas Kristof's article in 2019, right? That came out. And I don't know if you're familiar with all of that went on.
That was the New York Times.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, just these companies have. I mean, I would understand why they would say that, but they seem to be actively opposing age verification legislation. And I understand your point about, I mean, clearly they're looking for the higher paying customers. But clearly their model involves people coming for free content initially and then eventually moving to the paid content over a number of potentially years, right? So,
Right.
it would be nice to think that they were inclined
So,
to try to put it, but it doesn't seem for at least from the way they engage the public
so,
policy conversation, they don't seem interested in it.
so they are not against age verification, from my understanding and conversations, because what happens is right now is that many countries are only targeting the larger sites or the most obvious site like a Pornhub. And so what's happening is there's circumvention to the other sites. So that's a glitch. Everybody needs to get treated the same like you are when you go to a liquor store, right? If you are under the age of 18 in Alberta, you have to present identification that shows that you're over 18, whether you're in a restaurant or you're in at a liquor store. But with pornography, you need to do it to every site, not just one. So the industry has actually been advocating for what we call device level controls. So what that means is that the point of access is your device, and that device needs to implement a verification process that would be appropriate to any of the tools that are out there that protect your anonymity, all of that, because that's always a concern, right? When you hear the arguments against age verification, one of them is, well, how do we know that it's untraceable, that it's unlinkable, and that it does what it's supposed to do? That is our government's responsibility to make sure that whatever tool is used, that the third party that's doing it doesn't hold the information. And that's how age verification works. But if it's at the device level, then when you're accessing Google or Apple or Safari, in order to even access it, you have to have that control put in place. And it has to know that you're an adult accessing it. So if you're an adult, it looks like the way, we've looked at this is that everyone will get protected, not just whoever has age verification from a few sites. Now, the hundreds of thousands of sites that are out there that all have adult content on them are going to get protected and from minors accessing them, which is a much better option than just cherry picking who you're going to put age verification on. And so the industry has now really been advocating for device level control. So I throw this back to the government and say, why can we not amend the bill to lead the pack here? Because we've led the porn industry for years as Canadians. So why don't we lead the pack in fixing the problem properly and implement device level controls? So any device coming into Canada must have this software in place to protect children from accessing adult content. Why don't we do that? And we as adults can amend bills, can we not?
Right. Yeah, or I mean, the government could put forward government legislation on it, which would generally have an easier ride if there was a will to do that.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you about parents as well, and this maybe relates to the issue of device level controls as well. One of the arguments people use back when you say, well, there's no limits on kids accessing this material online, people will say, well, there are limits such as they are imposed by parents, and it's parents' responsibility to, and there's various forms of software that parents can get that they can put on devices that their kids are accessing. The counter to that point is to say that there's devices everywhere. Kids are accessing this content on friends' devices, on devices that they're maybe not supposed to be using. This is potentially a problem for a proposal around device level control. There would, I assume, under that model, still be a lot of sort of accidental access to content. What do you think of the argument that people say, well, this should just be left up to parents? And what are you hearing from parents about the kinds of support that they think they should have from regulation in order to protect their kids?
So there are there is software out there that you can download onto all of your digital devices if you have, excuse me, the financial resources. So we need to go back to the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child had an amendment a few years ago that talks about and protecting children from pornography. That means all children globally, and Canada ratified that agreement on the rights of the child. So we need to activate what we agreed to. And this is part of it. Not every family has the resources to spend $20 a month or whatever it is to have a software downloaded onto their device that will protect their children from accessing this content. And if there's 3 or 4 devices in a family or 5 devices, then we have a financial issue here, and that's not fair to the public.
Okay. So there's you're saying it's a rights issue, and there's also barriers for families to access this
Absolutely.
this kind of content.
There's barriers. If you're choosing between milk or groceries, you're going to pick groceries.
Yeah.
Even if it's macaroni. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like there's a lot of families here that are really suffering at that income level where they are not going to have the resources to have anything extra at all. And that's, they might have one computer that the whole family shares.
Mm-hmm. So, you've talked about some of the data around the harms at a kind of quantitative level. You also work with people at a clinical level. I wonder if you can give us maybe some of a kind of that more kind of individual sense of like what are some instances you can maybe share about things you've learned from talking to people directly that
Sure.
that have been affected by these issues.
So I realized way back in 2013, I really became specifically trained in this space in about 2012. It was several years of training that I underwent to do this work. And I realized that of the men that I was seeing, probably 99% of them had early exposure to pornography. Now, the older they were, and I had one man that was close to 80 who could not have a digital device in his house because he would hunt for pornography on it. This same individual got removed from a big box store for trying to access porn on their demonstration devices.
Hmm.
So it becomes a very obsessive compulsive behavior disorder. So the younger they were, the more they had come on stream initially when broadband internet increased its speed, because to download porn before that on a digital device took a long time. So those individuals were the first to come into treatment. And in particular, the tech savvy guys, because they were into porn before everyone else, because they knew how to download it faster. But the majority of individuals had actually had exposure to pictorial pornography before that. So we're talking, it takes probably 15 to 20 years from the time that you have been accessing. Now it's mostly online porn, right? The younger people I see, they might have seen, somebody's pictorial porn magazine that was shoved somewhere in a box in their house or under their parents' bed, or, somewhere where kids will find everything. So be careful where you put stuff. Kids find it. And they were accessing, they might have stumbled on these magazines. And then more recently, it's online porn, right? So, and we know, and I just know from talking to them, 99% of them have had early exposure to pornography at some level, depending on their age, where they started, right? But it usually takes 15 years sometimes a little longer before they realize they have a problem. So it grows over time because, again, it's new and different. They can't stop accessing it. Some of the individuals I treat go from pornography to sex trade workers to massage parlors to buying subscriptions on sites like OnlyFans or Strip Chat. Like there's a number of them. And therein lies a problem because they can't stop. They need it. They crave it. They want it. And the international or the World Health Organization designated what they call compulsive sexual behavior disorder as an impulse control disorder way back in 2020. I believe it became active in 2022 in the ICD-11. The International Classification of Diseases. So you will often hear some professionals debate that there's no such thing as sex addiction or porn addiction, that it doesn't exist because it's not in the DSM-5 TR, which is the latest classification in North America for diseases. But the World Health Organization has already implemented it as a compulsive behavior disorder. And there's debate around, around how that should continue to be recognized. I suspect now, with all of the research coming forward, that the DSM-5 TR in North America will adopt that at some point moving forward, as just like they have gambling disease in their eating disorders. We now know from the neuroscience that whether it's drugs, sex, gambling, or food, your brain works the same way in how it becomes activated, usually before you use the substance or before you watch the porn. You get the greatest hits of dopamine, which is a search and reward chemical that drives the motivation pathway for addiction.
Yeah. So you're seeing men that have had early exposure. You're seeing kind of the latent effects, right? So in some cases, people that were accessing content in a kind of less technologically advanced way. It sounds from what you're saying like we're kind of on the verge of really seeing these impacts
A
in a bigger
tsunami,
way.
a tsunami. And I can tell you that it is concerning because there are so many people coming forward. And I've also started to treat individuals that have morphed into child porn and do forensic evaluations of them as well, for the court systems or their lawyers to represent them on how they got here. Because it's usually, depending on their age again, was it pictorial pornography that they stumbled on first, or was it internet porn? Then what happened? Usually I see a perfect storm of events in a rupture of development. Maybe they were abused sexually at a very young age, and then one thing led to another, and
So could you just unroll a bit the effects on the lives of people that are dealing with this kind of addiction, impacts on job, relationship. You already mentioned it a bit, but other forms of potential criminality. You know, in terms of relationships, romantic relationships, and then other kinds of
so
relationships. What kinds of impacts are you seeing?
so it's devastating. It's really sad and devastating to see the impact to the family. So, if an individual is charged with a child pornography offense, this is now impacting their children and their partners. And and what does that do to the family? So, that's one aspect. If parents have been watching pornography and then a child goes to use their device and the pornography pops up, and for some reason they have the perfect storm of events where they are curious, they're interested. They may be a young teen who has, increased levels of oxytocin, which is a bonding chemical, and they want more of it. It's arousing and it's interesting. And so now we have this young teen that is watching porn, practicing um, sexual activities with other cohorts or boyfriends, girlfriends, you name it. And now they're 20 years old and they're in university, but they can't study because they're obsessed with watching pornography, and they need to watch pornography several hours a day. And this is true stories. So now they're failing out of school. That's on one end of the spectrum for a young person. Or now they've been watching pornography, and because pot is legalized, they're now using pot and porn. And so those are what we call comorbidities. So now we have a compulsive behavior that has happened with pot, and we have a compulsive behavior that has happened with pornography, and they have to do both together. We have meth and sex. I have individuals that are addicted to meth, and they're addicted to sex because they happen together. And it's dangerous, right?
And so are those addictions kind of self-reinforcing? Like you have
Yes.
these
Well,
compulsion for these.
they work together because what's wired together fires together in our brains from a neuroscience perspective. Like we create pathways that we practice because we do both together. So now you have habits that have formed because you can't do one without the other. And you start by doing one, then you introduce the other, and now you're doing both together regularly. So now we have a bit of a two-headed monster to deal with from a treatment perspective, right? That you have to deal with both. Now,
And it sounds like you're sorry, just to jump in. It sounds like you're making the point, that something that's not sort of biochemically addictive can still be addictive in terms of how our brains work. They develop addictions to things,
right.
gambling, pornography, because I've heard people say during the marijuana debate, okay, well, or debate to what extent it can be chemically addictive, but if it fits into this sort of compulsive pattern of behavior.
Right. It's like some people will drink or they'll smoke a cigarette before they have a drink, before they go to the bar, and then they'll ramp it up with cocaine and sex. And I've seen that movie in treatment. So they're all comorbid together. They all happen together. So they smoke a cigarette, they have a drink, they go to the bar, then they're vulnerable to cocaine and sex, or meth and sex, or they're on a roll. So their brains can't stop, and that's how an addicted brain works. It's not everyone. You know, we know that genetics plays a role here. And when it comes to substance use disorders, it's 60 to 40% genetics that you could have a substance use disorder. We don't know the numbers on pornography, but I know that ITAP, the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals, that trains a lot of the sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior disorder therapists, whatever language you want to use. They've got research that shows that 30 to 35% of individuals that access pornography could become addicted to it because of the very sophisticated algorithms to keep you there and more interested. And again, it's about new and different. So it's highly, highly seductive, literally, right? Because it wants to keep you interested. But then there's other research to show that 10% or 12% of the population suffers from a pornography addiction.
10 to 12% of the total adult population.
Well,
and if given the changes in technology, the changes in access, the statistics on children accessing, and the relationship between early exposure and potential addiction, you said earlier we're on the verge of a tsunami. Would you say that's true in the case of these addiction numbers as well?
I would say it's you were going to hear more and more of it. So from, again, a public health perspective, And I know that there are, in Alberta, we have many therapists that were trained by a foundation in this space, and they work within the public system as well as the private system. But we're going to need more people trained on how to treat this problem. Now, I know that in the criminal justice system, they are looking at new programming on how to treat individuals that access child pornography and pornography in general. But there's different philosophies on how you treat this. And not everyone believes in the abstinence program. And so we have, on a continuum, we have therapists that believe, well, you can't treat a compulsive behavior by allowing harm reduction, which means that you just use a little bit and it'll be okay. Because that is not how an addictive brain works. An addictive brain is going to get hits of dopamine by even the thought of using whatever it is, whether it's drugs, sex, gambling, or food. They're going to get hits of dopamine before they engage in the act. And so addicted brains are complex in that how does harm reduction work in that case? It doesn't. So we have all these different theories.
Yeah. So, just on that, like in terms of the different philosophies on treatment, this must be a real challenge for the criminal justice system um, in general, but also when you have child on child abuse. Um, how how should the law respond when you have a young child who is a victim um, and then also an offender subsequently on other children? Um,
This
and
is,
in the drug space, there's this discussion of mandatory treatment or coerced treatment as well. How should the system consider though, you know, voluntary versus mandatory in the context of treatment for this kind of issue?
you know what, Garnett, this is such an important question because we need to have, again, why the public health approach is we need to gather professionals from these spaces, and child protection is a primary example on treatment models that will be effective in treating children, in particular where there has been peer-on-peer sexual abuse, and it is a direct result of children accessing pornography. And you know that is one of the direct results. And so we're going to see more of that until children are as safe online as they are offline. And children
Hmm.
deserve that protection.
Yeah. Um, Dr. Jocelyn, you've been very generous with your time. I want to ask one final question before we wrap up. We've talked mainly about this public health issue, policy issue. Um, if you can speak directly to parents who are watching and listening, um, I'm a parent of young children as well. What are the steps that independent of law or public health agencies in the present reality? What are the steps you would advise parents take to really protect their kids?
I think that parents have to be very conscious of what their children are viewing, and what search and see what they're looking at, especially the older children. When you have younger children, um, you can have discussions with children in general about what are healthy pictures to look at, what are good pictures, what are bad pictures, what should you let me know about if you stumble on it. Those kinds of conversations open up the dialogue with your children about what they might be watching, and don't be afraid to ask them if they've seen pictures without clothing or they've seen things that they don't understand.
Okay, so have that conversation with your kids.
Yeah, it's not an easy conversation as a parent And as I think it's monitoring children's screen time
Yeah.
and their use of their digital devices. And if you are a parent that can put adult controls from adult content on your children's devices, I would do that. But there's a lot of parents that don't even think about this, that don't even think about the harms that this can cause.
Mm-hmm.
And so I appreciate the fact that you're doing this podcast, because it means more parents will become aware of this as even a problem, and that pornography on the internet is not benign. It has an impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for delivering this important message to the viewers and listeners of this podcast. This has been a really sobering conversation, but I think a very important one. We will share some links in the notes on the specific legislation, as well as to speeches given in Parliament on it. And we touched on that a bit, of course, but I really wanted to focus in on the evidence, the harms, both the numbers overall and the specific impacts. Dr. Jocelyn, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for the work you're doing on this issue. I hope more people listen to the important message you're conveying, and that we start to take a more serious public health approach to this issue.